The German troops defending the area in and around the city of Wesel were bravely fighting to protect the fatherland, but their tenacity would not be enough. By late March of 1945, the German army was exhausted, fighting a hopeless last stand on both fronts. Still, the weary soldiers on the western side had one cover left: the Rhine River. If the Allies were to cross the last major obstacle leading to the heart of Germany, the Third Reich would be over. Thus, the German resistance kept fighting to the last man, while the Allied armies made their way across the Rhine, trying to gain another foothold on their way to Berlin. But while the Germans engaged the enemy on their side of the river, they suddenly realized something odd. There was movement on the downed bridge. Without hesitation, they started shooting at the incoming enemy, but little did they know that the group included British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Beginning of the end. The Rhine River was the last major natural obstacle for the Allied advance on their way to the German capital. In late March of 1945, the invaders put together a massive operation that involved about 1 million soldiers from 3 different countries. The objective was to coordinate several crossings along the river. To support Operation Plunder, the Allies gathered over 4,000 pieces of artillery on the west bank, not to mention 250,000 tons of supplies. But an undertaking of such scale would not go unnoticed, and thus the Allies created the largest smokescreen ever laid to obscure their plans from the Germans. Moreover, the advance would be supported by Operation Varsity, the largest airborne mission executed in a single day. In it, no less than 14,000 paratroopers landed behind enemy lines east of the Rhine to knock out German artillery defending the water barrier. The assault on the ground consisted of crossing the river south of Wesel and advancing inland through a 5,000-yard stretch along a 2-mile front. It was crucial that as many troops crossed the river as quickly as possible so that the enemy didn't have much time to recover from the initial artillery blow. Indeed, the vast artillery support was conceived not only to neutralize their defenses near the river, but all possible routes used for reinforcements. As the preparations continued and the downed bridges were restored after being destroyed by the Germans, the Allied troops would have to rely on pontoon rafts and buffaloes for ferrying essentials. By March 21st, the Allies were finally ready, and the brigade moved from the Netherlands into Germany. This included British Prime Minister Winston Churchill himself. On the front lines. Winston Churchill joined the Royal Army as early as 1895 and fought in several conflicts even before World War I broke out. As a young man, he was deployed to India and Sudan and became a somewhat successful war correspondent in the Second Boer War. During the Gallipoli campaign, Churchill oversaw the operations as First Lord of the Admiralty, but after the appalling defeat, he was demoted to Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. He then joined the war effort in the trenches for 6 months as a battalion commander. Churchill remained an officer in the Army Reserve during the interwar period, and when he became Prime Minister, he would often showcase his collection of uniforms and medals while on military visits, aware of the propaganda value of his presence at the front. However, it is said that his staff often regarded Churchill as a reckless man, putting the nation's leadership at risk. Churchill even demanded to be part of the first wave of British troops advancing in the Normandy landings, an initiative that was promptly vetoed by King George VI. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower also had to appease the Prime Minister's avid wishes. While Churchill's presence on the front lines could have strategically helped, his biographers also note that the Prime Minister had a romanticized idea of a war leader. As such, when Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery left his headquarters near Venlo for the final advance toward Berlin in the spring of 1945, Churchill did not hesitate to join him. Clockwork. Large numbers of vehicles prepared to penetrate the enemy lines while waiting behind the smokescreen in the Rhine. The numerous troops were also briefed in detail about the crucial operation under brigade command. On the afternoon of March 23rd, the brigade headquarters were established, a mere 400 yards from the riverbank. Soon after, a preliminary bombardment started. After 2.5 hours, The Buffalo amphibious assault vehicles, loaded with 2 whole battalions, began their approach from the assembly areas to the river, reaching it at 9 a.m. sharp. The headquarters learned that both battalions had landed successfully within 6 minutes, and the next stage was put into motion. Before midnight, the 7th Black Watch and the 7th Argylls had taken most of their objectives. Then the 1st Black Watch passed them through, and by the early morning, they had captured their first objective. However, their left forward company was still engaged in fierce fighting at K.I. Esserden. The Germans then counterattacked on Spelldrop before dawn. K.I. Esserden was captured, but all communications with the company in Spelldrop were lost, and the situation deteriorated significantly. Still, it took the 7th Black Watch less than 2 hours to firmly establish their positions. At the same time, the duplex drive tanks were having difficulties landing on the beach as the terrain proved unsuitable. By 8 a.m., only 6 vehicles had been able to get out of the river, and 3 were committed with 1st Black Watch. The brigade headquarters were then moved to the far side of the river, and the brigade commander ordered the 1st Black Watch to launch another attack on Spelldrop. At 10:30 a.m., they met strenuous resistance and held on for several hours, but without the help of more tanks, the Allies were pushed back. In the retreat, confusion caused many elements to be cut off from the main formation and left behind. However, when Spelldrop was retaken that evening, the remaining survivors were still fighting, and even prevented any enemy reinforcements from passing. In Wesel, the British 1st Commando Brigade finally entered the city, while the U.S. 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions landed to the south with minimal casualties. The local resistance had been smothered by aerial bombardments and artillery, and before the end of the day, the Allies had a bridge across the river. It had taken the engineers of the 9th U.S. Army nearly 9 hours to build. First row. On March 25th, the British Prime Minister and the Field Marshal paid a visit to General Eisenhower at his headquarters. The general then enticed Churchill, telling him of a house across the river from Wesel where the main action was taking place. The stronghold had been sandbagged by American troops and was an excellent observation point. The 3 leaders then traveled 10 miles to the town of Buderisch. From the balcony, Churchill rejoiced in watching Royal Air Force aircraft pummeling German positions. Still, he could not look closely at the battle, even with his binoculars. As Eisenhower left his visitors to look into other matters, Churchill saw an American raft coming ashore just below the house. Without hesitating, he told Montgomery to come with him to the other side and get a closer look at the ongoing fight. They then crossed the Rhine on the craft, landing on the far bank. U.S. 9th Army Commander General William Simpson and Chief of the Imperial General Staff Sir Alan Brooke also came along for the ride, and Churchill then walked along the shore with a cigar between his lips. For about half an hour, the party moved freely through enemy territory without any resistance. Still, the group wanted to have a better view, but the fighting was still a mile away. They then decided to get closer to the action, but the city was surrounded by mines, and it was highly dangerous to travel by water. Without more options, the party returned to the West Bank. As they came back, they decided to approach the fighting by land, which was much more manageable. They then drove up to the railway bridge, which had been destroyed by the Germans, but still offered a first-row perspective of the battle. Churchill and a handful of others then climbed the ruins to get a better look from the other side, but as the Allied commanders clambered, the enemy noticed suspicious activity across the river. Close enough. From his vantage point, the Prime Minister could finally witness some of the action, with heavy German artillery raining on his troops a mile away. Still, Churchill appeared to have revealed his position, as the Germans quickly adjusted their battery and pointed directly at the British commander and his group. The first few shells fell 100 yards from their standpoint and sank in the river, spraying up liters of water. Despite his staff's best advice, Churchill stubbornly refused to get off the bridge, and he seemed to be enjoying the experience. After continuous requests, the party stepped down just as a second salvo hit close to their parking spot. Accompanied by a mere handful of American soldiers to protect them, the leaders went back to their cars and rushed to safety. Still, the British leader would not yield. Determined to cross the Rhine, he managed to get British 2nd Army Group Commander Lieutenant General Miles Dempsey to drive him to the town of Xanten, west of Wesel, the following day. There, the British engineers had crafted a pontoon bridge over the river. The Prime Minister was finally able to cross the Rhine, just in time to see the lines of German prisoners awaiting their sentence. Operation Plunder had gone like clockwork, and German resistance was absolutely smashed by the Allied artillery. The episode was the closest the Prime Minister had ever been to getting hit during World War II, and he would eventually reminisce about it in his memoirs with glee. Countdown. The war was not over yet, and there was more land to cover to get to Berlin. The 9th Canadian Infantry Brigade then relieved the Black Watch and engaged what was left of the German resistance north of Rees. As for the defenders, their front was incomplete, and they had no reserves. Their artillery was feeble, they had no air support, and only a few tanks in operation. Besides, their communications were weak. They lacked so much strength that the generals decided against using the troops to avoid needless casualties. Against strict orders from the Supreme Command to hold the positions and fight, General Gunther Blumentritt decided to withdraw what was left of his forces. In a single week, the invaders had taken 30,000 prisoners of war. The Allies had a clear advantage in both numbers and equipment, and they soon established a bridgehead, which was 35 miles wide and 20 miles deep. Even Nazi politician Joseph Goebbels wrote about the circumstances in his diary, quote, "The situation in the West has entered an extraordinarily critical, ostensibly almost deadly phase." When Churchill returned to the western side of the Rhine, he didn't know it had been his last incursion of World War II. At last, the conflict was in its final stage. When the Allied troops crossed the Rhine, the days of Hitler's reign of terror were numbered. Thank you for watching our video. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button, and check out all our Dark Documentaries channels for more epic stories from the World Wars. Also, please let us know your thoughts in the comments section below, and make sure to hit the bell icon to receive notifications about our newest stories. Stay tuned for more. Stay tuned for more.